Welcome to the Lodzer for yet another exciting event. I have had the privilege to read through the slides and fascinated. Lots of history. He's pressing the button when we're showing you everything already. Okay. Those of you here for the first time, hands up. Oh, I have to get you the spiel then. All right. Lodzer Synagogue was established by survivors of the Lodz Ghetto and subsequently came to Canada. You'll find Lodzer congregations pretty much all over the world, but only one like ours that became a synagogue congregation. The majority of them are social committees and brotherhoods, etc., etc. Unfortunately, most of our members have passed on over the years. Some made it to 100. But their children and friends like myself, I'm not from Lodz, have maintained the synagogue in good shape and are happy to announce that we have a vibrant social life for a small congregation like ours. It's a small family, but to use the proper word, it's a Hamish shul. Everybody knows everybody, even whether you like them or not. And those of you are here who are regulars on Shabbat, and they're all waving and smiling at me. They'll let me later. You know, we have a choir, we have programming, we have a klezmer concert coming up with a full klezmer company of, I think, 13? Nine? Sorry, 9. But they are very well known in Toronto. So please come and join us on the 15th. We have our regular Christmas dinner on the 24th with a nice movie and Chinese food. What else do the Jews do at Christmas? And other events, book chats, rabbis' lectures, etc., etc. And if you like good voices, I'm one of them, and there's a few members of the choir here. Please join us on Rosh Chodesh Shabbat, or just preceding the Rosh Chodesh. We have anywhere from 10 to 22 people up here singing with our cantor David Young. And thank God our rabbi does not sing, but his lectures are interesting. If he was singing, I wouldn't join the choir. And without further ado, just one request: if you do have cell phones, please put them on vibrate, or shut them off for the hour, or so that we're here and enjoy the lecture. Alan?
Thank you very much, Rafi. Hello, everyone. Just in case we have not met before, I'm Alan Herman. I'm with the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, and I'm one of the Toronto co-chairs. You may also know Doris Epstein, who is one of the other co-chairs, as well as Sally Zerker, Professor Emerita, who is our academic director. And just a quick few words about the Institute before we begin with the presentation. We, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, we've been around for over 30 years now. In fact, this year, tomorrow, Dr. Gerstenfeld will be in Montreal to help celebrate the 31st anniversary of the Institute. And we were created because back in the 80s, when the first Intifada began, a handful of professors, led by Professor Krantz, saw rampant anti-Israelism, anti-Semitism happening on the university campuses there in Montreal, saw an insufficient response from the Jewish community at that time, and said, we are going to go it alone, and we are going to counter this rampant scourge which is taking place on the campuses. They started to have presentations, conferences, panel discussions. They organized trainings, they organized workshops, they started to put out academic journals, they started to put out student journals, they created a daily email alert when the technology came around. Anything and everything to counter the misinformation that was rampant at that time, and sadly continues to be necessary to be fought today as well. Far beyond simply being on the campuses of Montreal, the CIJR has expanded into the community, and we've been operating here in Toronto for about 8 years now. And just to illustrate a few of the types of programs that we offer here, essentially we combat anti-Semitism anywhere and everywhere we can in Toronto with talks such as Dr. Gerstenfeld's talk here tonight. If she raises her hand, Lauren Isaacs wants to raise her hand. She was a speaker of ours at Beth David just a few weeks ago, where she was also talking about how to counter anti-Semitism. In a couple of weeks' time at December 12th in Beth David. Michael Mostyn of B'nai B'rith will be talking about proven lessons on how to counter anti-Semitism from the B'nai B'rith experience. So we mean business when we talk about really trying to stop this vile scourge that is anti-Semitism. We also advocate heavily for Israel, and you really can't go wrong from coming out to our programming. One of our most recent excellent talks about Israel and about Israel advocacy comes from Professor Sally Zerker, who I referenced earlier, and she has a powerful talk on the Jewish legal and indigenous rights of the land of the Jews to the land of Israel, which she gives, and it is absolutely phenomenal. You cannot go wrong by coming to hear it. As well, we also have programming, which we call Inspiring People with the Jewish Story. And to that effect, just a few weeks ago in this very room, we had an inspiring story about how the Jews of Greece in a particular village in Greece were actually hidden and rescued by the villagers of their day, where they lived. And this village rescued them and hid them from the Shoah, and it's thanks to that heroism from the village that all those people survived. And it's one of the few stories like that took place in Greece, and certainly you certainly don't need me to tell you how little it happened throughout the rest of the Shoah. So if you come to these programs, you will be inspired by the Jewish story, you will know how to advocate for Israel, you'll know how to counter anti-Semitism. It doesn't get much better than that. So please make sure you're on our mailing list. Now, as for our speaker today was born in Austria. He obtained a PhD in organic chemistry from Amsterdam University, and he's been living in Israel for decades. He is an expert, one of the world's eminent experts on anti-Semitism, how to counter it. And let me just dig up one of the other really amazing facts that I dug up on Professor Gerstenfeld, Dr. Gerstenfeld, that I just wanted to share with you. And bear with me one moment.
Slide one. Go back.
His experience includes financial and economic consultancy to board memberships of several Israeli firms, including the Israel Corporation, one of Israel's largest corporations. He's the former chairman of the steering committee of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and he founded and directed the center's post-Holocaust and anti-Semitism program. He specializes in Israeli Western European relations, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism. He is a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award 2012 of the Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Let us have a big round of applause for Dr. Gerstenfeld.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for the applause. And let's hope that I'm worthy of it. Let me start with some estimates of anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League carried out a global study in 2014, and the countries covered held 89% of the world's population. What they found was that more than 1 billion people are anti-Semites, according to the ADL definition. This translates into about 75 anti-Semites for every Jew in the world, and that includes babies and Jewish self-haters. I should clarify here that the ADL survey concerns only classic anti-Semitism and not the third modern form, anti-Israelism. Broadly speaking, there are historically 3 major types of anti-Semitism. The first and oldest is religious anti-Semitism. Initially it was mainly Christian, but with the rise of Islam it became also Muslim. Christian originating anti-Semitism started more than 15 centuries ago in the Roman Catholic Church. The key hate motif of Christian anti-Semitism is that Jews are eternally responsible for the death of Jesus. That is not true. Under the Roman occupation, the Jews were not allowed to kill anybody. Only the Romans could. Secondly, people cannot be held responsible for what their parents did. How absurd it is that Jews are held responsible for what their ancestors more than 50 generations ago didn't do. It was in the German grandfather generation that the most horrendous Genocide in history against the Jews was committed. But the children and grandchildren of the Nazis are not responsible for this genocide. Richard von Weizsäcker was president of Germany from 1984 until 1994. He had been a soldier in the German army. His father, however, Ernst von Weizsäcker, was a German diplomat who was condemned in one of the Nuremberg trials. Nobody accused the German president, Richard von Weizsäcker, for the crimes of his father. Nobody researched what his ancestors had done wrong. Once we start blaming people for the shortcomings and the crimes of their ancestors, democratic society collapses. Christianity beyond that also stereotyped the Jews. Instead of blaming some individual people, it applied its blame to all Jews. With this, it made an important contribution to what nowadays we call racism. Stereotyping of people is a core element of racism. When Christians brutalized Jews, they claimed then that the suffering of the Jews which they had caused was the punishment because they hadn't recognized Jesus. Now, Christian anti-Semitism wasn't limited to Roman Catholics. Among the Protestant reformers, Martin Luther, in his later years, stands out as a rabid anti-Semite. He wrote that Jews should be housed in stables. Their books should be taken away. If rabbis preached, they should be killed. For the honor of God and Christianity, synagogues, including the Lodzer one, should be burned. Nowadays, the World Council of Churches is one of the major inciters against Israel. On this infrastructure, which was created by Christians, the second type of anti-Semitism developed, ethnic nationalist anti-Semitism. It's only in the 19th century that the word anti-Semitism was coined in Germany by Wilhelm Marr. This meant specifically anti-Judaism. All those who claim that Arabs are also Semites and are thus included in anti-Semitic hatred talk, they talk nonsense.
I can do the slides.
There are good reasons to say that Christianity and Christian anti-Semitism laid the basis for the Holocaust. Christian anti-Semitism targeted Judaism as a religion. There was still an escape route. You could convert to Christianity, but ethnic nationalist anti-Semitism targeted the Jews as a people. There were no escape routes from that in the Holocaust. Without the infrastructure created by Christians, there would not have been the enormous willingness in European societies to carry out the murders or collaborate with the German murderers. These two types, religious and ethnic nationalist anti-Semitism, are considered classic anti-Semitism. It is to this classic anti-Semitism, as I have said, that the ADL Global Study refers to, and where these more than 1 billion anti-Semites were found. We also have a breakdown of the statistics of anti-Semitism by religion. Which religion is more anti-Semitic than others? Now, what I'm going to say is not politically correct. And I can only afford that because I come from a free country, Israel. I do not have to change the truth or avoid mentioning the facts. The global ADL study found that 49% of Muslims in the world are classic anti-Semites. That's nervous.
No, which one did you want, sir?
Number 5.
I'm following you.
You
I'm following you.
Let me see.
Or
The other. Okay. These 49% are classic anti-Semites, people who are against the Jews. This not includes the ones who are against Israel. In the ADL studies of attitudes toward Jews in more than 100 countries around the world, it was discovered that of the 74% of those people interviewed who had never seen a Jewish person, 25% have anti-Semitic attitudes. These questions the ADL asked are 11 standard anti-Semitic stereotypes, just to mention a few. Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the country they live in. Jews have too much control over global affairs. Jews have too much control over global media. Jews are responsible for most of the world's war. Those who agreed with at least 6 out of 11 stereotypes were considered anti-Semites by the ADL. In the Middle East and Northern Africa, 74% of the people scored as classic anti-Semites. In English-speaking countries, 13%. The most widely accepted stereotype in the world is that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the country they live in. Broadly speaking, in 5 out of the world's 7 regions, the study found that give or take between 37 and 45% of the world considered this stereotype to be true. That was true in Western Europe, Oceania, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas and Asia. Only in, what was very interesting also, that the study found that in the Middle East and Africa, the more people are educated, and they'll be dealing with Muslims, the more they are likely to hold anti-Semitic views. The opposite is true in the West. The Middle East and North Africa are also the hotbeds in the world of Holocaust distortion. 63% of the people who have heard of the Holocaust believe that it is a myth or it has been greatly exaggerated. It is in the West not common to say the truth about Muslim anti-Semitism, which is the leading anti-Semitism in the world, because there are many reasons why it is not politically correct, but it isn't the less, it's true. Now, in the stereotypes, the ADL also asked the question, how many Jews are there in the world? Well, 9% of those surveyed believe that the Jews make up 20% of the world's population. This would mean that there are about 1.4 billion Jews in the world. It doesn't end there. An additional 18% think that Jews are more than 10% of the world population, or at least 700 million people. 48% of those surveyed, about half, think that Jews make up more than 1%, and thus are about 70 million. In reality, Jews are only 0.19% of the population, about 15 million people. Outside the Middle East and North Africa, more people view Israel favorably than those who view it unfavorably. In the Middle East and North Africa, and again Muslim territory, 84% view Israel unfavorably and 9% favorably. Beyond this, the ADL has done separate studies in a number of European countries, as well as the United States and Argentina. In this, it was all done in this century. It found that about 26% of Christians believed that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. That is, until today, Christian anti-Semitism is alive and kicking. With all the anti-Semitic propaganda over the centuries, it is not so surprising that anti-Semitism is an integral part of Western culture. You can alternatively say that anti-Semitism is profoundly interwoven with Western culture. And if you want to be a sophisticated person, you can say that anti-Semitism is a cultural code of the Western world. In my professional career, I've not always been an anti-Semitism researcher. I have been a strategic business consultant. I have served a variety of, which at least part of my clients were some of the largest European and American corporations. And there you learn that you have to look out of every complex problem, you have to isolate 3 issues. That's what your client is able to understand. So I'm going to look in this lecture mainly at the three major strategic priorities in the battle against anti-Semitism. One of these priorities is to make more politicians and high-profile figures in the Western world publicly admit that anti-Semitism is an integral part of Western culture. I will explain later why this is potentially very important. So what are these major strategic priorities in the battle against anti-Semitism? The greatest priority, and we have failed, is to convince the Israeli government to finally set up an anti-propaganda organization. The second is to make more Western politicians and high-profile figures publicly admit that anti-Semitism is an integral part of Western culture. The third strategic priority is to start exposing Jewish masochists. We all know those people who criticize Israel because it isn't perfect. Jewish masochists. They consider it not worth mentioning that the United States and other democratic countries have major deficiencies. And they also forget, probably knowingly, that Israel's immediate enemy is the criminal and crime-glorifying Palestinian society. There are, of course, a million smaller issues in the battle against anti-Semitism than the three I have just mentioned. That's why my major book is called, on anti-Israelism, is called The War of a Million Cuts. The subtitle is, perhaps you can read that, The Struggle Against the Delegitimization of Israel and the Jews and the Growth of New Anti-Semitism. The foreword for this book was written by the former Spanish Prime Minister José María Aznar, and those who wrote advance praise include a minister or former ministers of Sweden, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands and Italy. You can now, if you want to, download it for free from the internet. After the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, I've explained that, it's part of Western culture, so it continued. Not all the Nazis, of course, and the large number of European collaborators suddenly became full-fledged, non-racist Democrats. Yet, slowly, the awareness of the Holocaust started to become embedded in the culture of Western society. Now it became taboo in decent environments to be a Nazi or to promote genocide. That now became the symbol of absolute evil in Western culture. In many environments, it was politically incorrect to be a classic anti-Semite. There were still people like that, but they were often marginal. You can now find them, for instance, in the British Labour Party, the second largest party in the United Kingdom, and among its elected officials. The party has been chaired for the past 4 years by the leftist Jeremy Corbyn, and this man, Corbyn, is a part-time anti-Semite. He makes, however, despite the fact that he is a part-time anti-Semite, he makes frequent declaration that anti-Semitism is vile and has to be fought. So now you had a difficult situation. On the one hand, classic anti-Semitism became politically incorrect. On the other hand, anti-Semitism is simply a part of the Western culture. There was no other solution than that it had to mutate into something else. So slowly but surely, the third major type of anti-Semitism came into the European mainstream. It was no longer against the Jewish religion or the Jewish people. The newer form of anti-Semitism focused on the Jewish state, Israel. This anti-Semitism sometimes is called new anti-Semitism. We might also call it mutated contemporary anti-Semitism. I'll give you one example of how anti-Semitism, which is interwoven with European culture and evolves with it, has mutated. A small example. In 1391, which is, I would say, more than 600 years ago, many Jews were murdered in Spain. Others converted to Christianity, and alternatively, what remained, those were expelled. No Jews remained, for instance, in Valencia, which today is the third largest city in Spain. We go fast forward from 1391 to 2018. In 2018, upon a proposal of the extreme left party Podemos, the majority of the Valencia City Council voted to boycott Israel. The national leader of this horrible leftist party called the Jewish state an illegal country and a criminal country. This anti-Semitism is still there in the heart of Valencia. It only has mutated. Anti-Israelism has the same core motifs as the two previous manifestations of anti-Semitism. However, they have mutated. I'll give an example. In Christian anti-Semitism, the Jews were the absolute evil because of the accusation that they held against Jesus, the alleged Son of God. Under the Nazis, Jews were absolute evil, that includes you and me, because they were born defective insects, vermin or bacteria. In the Nazi anti-Semitism, as said, the Jews were subhuman. Nowadays, Nazis and planning genocide are, however, the absolute evil in Western societies. We know from studies that large parts of the European population believe that Israel intends to commit genocide of the Palestinians, or that Israel behaves toward the Palestinians like the Nazis did toward the Jews. I mean, these are Western cultured people, and I give the figures soon. The comparison of Israel to Nazi Germany is found almost everywhere in the world. I hope you can read this, which I am not going to read. I hope you can read it yourself. But this is a daily paper which was close to the now largely shrunk socialist parties. Jews were in Auschwitz and Dachau, not to suffer, but to learn. And you have here another slide from the nice Western world. Here you have Sharon becomes Hitler in a demonstration in Washington outside the AIPAC offices. And I said it's everywhere. This is from Kenya, the English press in Kenya. And even a pro-Jewish, pro-Israeli paper, the British Daily Telegraph, published this. No, we are wrong. I don't know why this cartoon has escaped, but you'll have to believe me. From studies we know that probably 40% or more of the adults in the European Union believe that Israel intends to commit genocide against the Palestinians, or alternatively that Israel behaves towards the Palestinians like the Nazis did toward the Jews. That's a major reflection of contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe. Now, if you use your brains, then you start understanding that it took the Germans only two years during the Holocaust to murder 2 million people, mainly Jews, in 3 extermination camps, in Belzec, in Sobibor and Treblinka. How long would it take Israel to exterminate the Palestinians if it wanted to do so? And how come that Israel wants to exterminate the Palestinians, and there's so many Palestinians you still see on the international television? But if you want to realize that Israel is not criminal, but the perceptions of Europeans are criminal, that is asking too much of the brains of large parts of the European population. On the basis of findings from these surveys, we know that 150 million adults out of 400 million adults of the citizens of the European Union are extreme anti-Semites. I had an argument on this issue with the late Robert Wistrich, He was the leading academic anti-Semitism scholar of our generation. He disagreed with me. He said that he was willing to believe that 150 million citizens of the European Union are idiots. Nowadays, I believe that we are both right. These people are both idiots and anti-Semites. In view of this horrifying anti-Semitic, anti-Israel statistics, one wonders, where do these views come from? The media play a huge role. These are mainly the left liberal media. Others include politicians, also mainly from the left, trade unions, NGOs, including human rights NGOs, academics, and so on. The representation of Jews, of Israeli leaders, as Nazis, we also find in cartoons. These you can find both in the left media, left liberal, which is something else than left, of course, and Arab papers. The one I have up here, which I'll soon have up here, Sharon as a Nazi. That is a cartoon which comes from Norway, supposedly an advanced country. There is a Norwegian German-born cartoonist, Finn Graf, who published this cartoon in the third largest Norwegian paper called Dagbladet. He had learned the trade, so in a later one he published Prime Minister Ehud Olmert as a Nazi camp commander, also in Dagbladet. Now you would say that society rejects this. No. In 2007, King Harald V of Norway awarded the highest honor of Norway to the extreme anti-Semite Graf for his work. The Egyptian state daily, Al Akbar, published a caricature showing Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak in the image of Hitler. The British left-wing daily Independent published a cartoon of Sharon eating a child. Now you would say, well, this is rejected by British society. No, it won the prize for the best British cartoon in 2003. This is simply a new version of the blood libel. Okay, so far what I have shown you are all anti-Israeli cartoons, but you have also anti-Semitic cartoons. One extreme cartoon was published by the British left liberal daily The Guardian. The man you see here is the then leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard, who is Jewish, with a glass of blood in his hand, and the caption, "Do you drink what I drink?" It was another mutation of the ancient motif, which originated in England, the blood libel. The original blood libel claimed that Jews killed Christians for ritual purposes. In the Arab world, the blood libel is widely spread. You see here the Arab English weekly Al-Aram, which is appearing in Cairo, to show how Israeli soldiers put Arabs in a press and their blood is drunk by Orthodox Jews. Also Jews as absolute evil we find in Arab cartoons. In the official Palestinian Authority paper, Al-Hayat Al-Yadida, the 20th century welcomes, on the left, welcomes the 21st century, and they point to the Jew in the middle as the sickness of the century. You have modern versions of the blood libel everywhere in Europe, or at least in many places. The current leader of the Norwegian Labour Party, Jonas Gahr Støre, wrote advance praise for a book which claimed that Israel entered Gaza to kill Palestinian women and children. I'm now going to make, and perhaps I'll drink some water or something before I make to another politically incorrect statement. The main verbal source of anti-Israelism in Western society and its public discourse is liberal left liberalism. I'm not saying it's the only source. As far as violence in Western society is concerned, Muslims and right-wingers have a major role, not only in anti-Semitism, but also in anti-Israelism. However, in public discourse, you don't hear these people because that is dominated by the left liberal press. New York Times is a typical example. Now, what you probably do not realize, that anti-Semitism, and particularly the anti-Israeli incitement of the left liberals and the left, insert themselves in the long history what I always call progressive perversity. This goes back to the beginning of the 16th century. The Prince of Humanism, Erasmus of Rotterdam, held extreme anti-Semitic behavior of even for his time. Progressive perversity manifests itself not only against Jews. We find it, for instance, in this major case of progressivity, the French revolutions. There the progressives had even a special tool to massively chop off the heads of other progressives. That was the guillotine. Progressive perverts should not be confused with another subcategory, the humanitarian racists. They may single out Israel for blame and make even true claims. They, however, do not blame states which have done far more severe things. A major source of worldwide hatred comes from the United Nations and associated bodies such as the United Nations Human Rights Council, UNHRC. One of the many ways that one can define the United Nations is as a hater Israel world gathering. Yet recently the United Nations did something very unusual. They produced their first report on anti-Semitism. Nobody had expected that. Several international organizations, Jewish organizations, praised the report. Hardly anybody besides myself, however, prepared a critical analysis of this document. The report said a number of true things. It mentioned that anti-Semitism is global, it exposed anti-Semitic tropes, it stated that perpetrators of the hatred of Jews include white supremacists, neo-Nazis, members of radical Islamist groups, as well as leftists. This, however, was not in the right order. It also used a wrong term. It separated artificially Islamists from other Muslims. Had the report been more daring and true, it would have, instead of radical Islamist group, put there the perpetrators, among the perpetrators of the hatred of Jews in the world, many Muslims. The report gave substantial attention to the predominant definition of anti-Semitism, that of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which definition which includes also examples of anti-Israelism. The report also mentioned the importance of anti-Semitic crimes against Jews among all hate crimes in the United States and Canada. And it also discussed BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions. It did not, however, take a position against BDS. Now, if you are a critical observer of anti-Semitism, which I hope I am, there are a certain number of important issues missing in the UN report. They come under two categories. The first one are issues which are simply taboo to mention for somebody who is paid by the United Nations. And I will refer to the major taboos. The reporter of the United Nations couldn't say that the UN and its associated organizations play a huge role in promoting anti-Semitism of the anti-Israel variety. The second taboo is linking major anti-Semitism to parts of the Muslim world. Muslim states make up a substantial percentage of UN members. Muslim states are the major single force in the United Nations anti-Israel hate-mongering activities. Even a superficial look at global anti-Semitism makes it clear that by far the largest threat to world Jewry comes from the Muslim world. It is only there that one finds leaders of states promoting extreme anti-Israelism. Iran promotes genocide against Jews or against Israel. So does some Muslim terror organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah. There is a third major taboo issue which the report cannot refer to. I have already mentioned it earlier. Antisemitism is an integral part of Western culture. There is a fourth taboo, namely that antisemitism exists in many Western socialist or social democratic parties. Let's not make the mistake that all socialist antisemitism focuses only on Israel as a hate project. I have published many articles on what goes on in the British Labour Party. We find there a long series of anti-Israel expressions, also as a long series of anti-Jewish expressions. Its chairman, Jeremy Corbyn, is a long-time anti-Israel insider. He is a friend of a Holocaust denier to whom he has given money. He has shared the podium with another Holocaust distorter. Corbyn can be defined as a part-time anti-Semite. Now I've spoken about this one category, which is the taboos. But there is a second category of major aspects of antisemitism, which is not mentioned in the report. These are not politically taboo subjects. There is no mention of quantitative data on antisemitism in the report. The author could easily have taken the figures from the ADL global study. There is no quantitative data about the comparison of Israel's attitude toward the Palestinians to those of the Nazis against the Jew. This despite the fact that the information is easily available. And there is also nothing about Christian antisemitism. There is also no mention that in Europe the frequent use of the word Jew is a synonym for an evil person. I think, and I'll get another sip of tea, that by now you have at least grasped that there is, in order to analyze contemporary anti-Semitism, is a fairly complex issue. There are very few institutions who specialize in this field, and their contribution to understanding the issue are rather limited. And analyzing anti-Semitism wasn't always that complex. If the Canadian Institute of Jewish Research had invited me, say 500 years ago, to speak to its members, I could have finished it in a few minutes. I would have invited a Roman Catholic priest. He would have said Jews are eternally responsible for the deaths of our Savior. And then I would also have invited a Lutheran preacher who would have said all synagogues should be burned. I guess that the entire CIJR audience 500 years ago would have understood what anti-Semitism is after these two guest presentations. And it brings me to another important issue. The period we live in is called post-modernity. There is no better definition for this period than that it comes after modern times. And one of the major aspects of post-modernity is the fragmentation of many themes and subjects. So the core motifs of anti-Semitism have not only mutated over the years, they have also fragmented. Thus, what I could finish in 5 minutes 500 years ago, I can now very superficially only cover in an hour. I said earlier that anti-Semitism is interwoven with Western culture. It has been there for more than 1500 years. If you promote an idea for such a long time, it develops with the development of the culture. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that most Westerners are anti-Semites, but Western culture is impregnated with anti-Semitism. This has been brilliantly shown in a book by an American historian of the University of Chicago, David Nierenberg. It's titled Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. The Washington Post wrote that this book shows that many of the important conceptual and artistic development in culture, from St. John to St. Augustine to Muhammad, from Shakespeare to Luther, to Hegel, depend on denigrating Jews. That's what shows Schilling. Great cultural achievements built on the patterns of scapegoating and hatred. The emergence of anti-Semitism hasn't ended classic anti-Semitism. I have spoken about the 49% of the Muslim classic anti-Semites in the world and the 25% of Christian anti-Semites. And there are also neo-Nazis, if they are not so many. You find them not only in Germany. In Sweden, an extreme left liberal country, the Jewish community in the town of Lumia had to disband a few years ago because of the threats by neo-Nazis. And there are many other ways to prove that anti-Semitism is interwoven with Western culture. The word Shylock has become a standard expression of Jewish ugliness, and you find it regularly. There are much bigger financial institutions than the Rothschild banks. However, Rothschilds are still the symbol of evil capitalism. I've also mentioned the word Jew as an expression, even between youngsters in Europe, of an evil person. And yet another indication, the major philosopher of Europe, or perhaps of the world, in the second part of the 20th century was a Nazi, the German Martin Heidegger. I can give you an additional proof that anti-Semitism is interwoven with Western culture. In postmodernity, you have new intellectual or ideological currents. And sooner or later, all these currents develop anti-Semitic expressions or are Holocaust distortions. The dirtiest of the lot is the human rights movement. It's not only full of anti-Israeli NGOs, its highest organ, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UNHRC, is a morally corrupt body permeated by anti-Semitism. Your countryman, Hillel Neuer, has shown that very clearly. Only one country is criticized on every accessions agenda, that is Israel. There is even a special UN rapporteur for that critique. He happens to be a Canadian. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and Syria are elected members of the Human Rights Council. But that is only one modern ideology. There are many other examples of ideological movements in which anti-Semitism emerges. Feminism is a clear example. So are parts of the LGBT movement. Some people there accuse Israel of pinkwashing. This is the accusation that Israel's granting of equal rights to the gay community is a means of diverting attention from its supposed discrimination against Palestinians. Then you have the intersectionality movement, which aims for the solidarity of all victims except Jews. In academia, post-colonialism advocates may call Israel a colonial power. That is a huge distortion, because Israel's behavior toward the Palestinians bears no resemblance to the massive crimes of the Belgian, British, Dutch, French, German, Portuguese and Spanish colonizers over the century. They conquered other people to make money. The Jewish people did the opposite. They invested great efforts and substantial sums of money into reviving their ancestral land, Israel, from its long-standing neglect. In extreme veganism and the anti-nuclear movement, the Holocaust is abused. And with the increase of the climate change issue, the Green parties will get stronger. Quite a few of them are like watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. Yet very few people in the Jewish world, and hardly any in the non-Jewish world, have stated this interweaving of anti-Semitism and Western culture. And why is that so important, that we bring prominent non-Jewish people to recognize that anti-Semitism is part of Western culture? Once Jews and non-Jews agree to this, it becomes far easier to point out how arrogant many of these Western countries are toward the Jews. Once it is more commonly understood that anti-Semitism is part of Western culture, we can start in our discussions with Westerners from a common basis. The most common definitions, I've already mentioned it, of anti-Semitism is that of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And that was a great step forward. It can now be used in combination with the anti-Semitism is part of Western culture argument. According to the CIJR definition, the singling out of Israeli settlement for specific labeling by the European Union is an anti-Semitic act. Similar labeling is not done for the products of any other countries. This is one of the many new mutations of anti-Semitism as a part of Western culture. Yet another further-reaching example of European arrogance is that of the support for the so-called two-state solution. European countries keep telling us that the two-state solution is desirable and will solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. If one thinks about this, you come exactly to the opposite conclusion. Why would upgrading of the Palestinian Authority to a state change its behavior? They reward murders of Israeli civilians. Would the PA stop doing that if they were a state? The Palestinians have been offered generous proposals for peace by both Prime Minister Barak and Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Arafat and then Abbas turned them down. And you would expect the Palestinian streets to protest this. This was a chance for peace. During the Arab Spring, we have seen Tunisians, Egyptians, Libyans, as well as people in other Arab states taking to the streets to improve their reality. We now see these days Lebanese, Iraqis, Egyptians take to the street. Nothing similar has ever happened with the Palestinians. You get the strong impression that they want a state on a platter to be handed to them by the United Nations. In that way, they can continue their criminal acts. Telling and pushing Israel to accept the two-state solution fits well with the Western tradition of anti-Semitism. There is one country for which these remarks, if its government makes them, are particularly problematic and obnoxious. It's Germany. In their grandfather generation, the greatest genocide of Jews in history took place by Germans. And we are now being told that there is a new Germany which has learned its lesson. And if we look closer, we realize that there are indeed many new Germans. But there are also old-type Germans, neo-Nazis. They are allowed by the government of Chancellor Merkel to march today in the streets of German cities to shout, for instance, "Never ever again Israel." This shout by the children and grandchildren of the generation of German criminals has been permitted by a German court. According to the Bertelsmann Foundation, 41% of Germans think that Israel behaves toward the Palestinians like the Nazis did toward the Jews. And we know from a study by the World Jewish Congress that 6 million Germans think that people should be allowed to use today Nazi slogans and symbols in Germany today. And another 8 million are not sure. The other 54 million say that it is not allowed. Even more Germans, close to 8 million, 11% of the adult population, think that it is acceptable for an individual to hold neo-Nazi views. Another 8 million are not sure. One can conclude from this that those radicals who promote unhindered free speech would make it possible for even more substantial anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hate speech in a country with such a horrible past as Germany. It is not only large parts of the German population of which we should be suspicious, it's also the government. Since 2015, it has imported without any selection more than 1 million people from Muslim countries. Many hundreds of thousands of them are anti-Semites. The Merkel government is the largest importer of anti-Semites in Europe. The German government also participates in incitement against Israel at the United Nations. In November 2018, there were 21 UN General Assembly resolutions against Israel. Germany voted for 16. in favor of these anti-Israel resolutions. On 4, it abstained. The Merkel government allows adherents of a genocidal Muslim organization to march every year 1 day on Al-Quds Day in Berlin. The Merkel government cuddles up to the genocide-promoting Iranian government. Germany's socialist president Frank-Walter Steinmeier has sent congratulations to Iran's leaders on the occasion of 40 years of the revolutionary government of Iran. Steinmeier refused to send congratulations to Donald Trump when he was elected President of the United States. I have little doubt, and you can take that down, that Germany will be facing huge problems in the coming years. Germany is a country Jews and Israel can absolutely not trust. Now I am getting relatively close to the end of what I have to say. What is the best way to fight the many anti-Israel hate mongers in the world? And we know the Israeli government fights its enemies against the military enemies. Israel has put up a defense force and invested heavily in it. Nowadays the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, are one of the best armies in the world. And if you want to gain intelligence on Israel's enemy, the government has 3 agencies. The Foreign Intelligence Agency, the Military Agency, and the Domestic Agency. Israel agencies are very competent in this field, both the General Intelligence Agencies, the Mossad, the Military Agency, the Amman, and the Domestic Agency, Shabak. And when cybersecurity became a problem, Israel put up a cyber defense entity. It invests heavily in it. Israel is likely to become a world leader in cybersecurity. Yet, no country in the world is attacked as much by propaganda as Israel. What would have been more logical than that the Israeli government puts up an anti-propaganda agency? It has been proposed by at least one foreign Jewish leader and also his own staff members to Prime Minister Netanyahu to establish such an anti-propaganda agency. Netanyahu refuses to do so. Israel and the Jews pay a heavy price for this mistaken attitude. Allow me to take another sip while you let the anti-Semitism settle down. In my book, which I've mentioned and which you can download for free, The War of a Million Cuts, I have explained how such an anti-propaganda agency would work. Estimates put the annual cost of such an agency at around $250 million. That's not something impossible for the Israeli state budget. I'll give you an example, so in order not to speak in abstract terms, but in concrete ones, how can we deter some enemies of Israel? And that is, I think, appropriate in view of what goes on in Toronto's universities. There are many academics who support BDS against Israel. And they have a free anti-Semitic lunch. There is personally nothing. So how do you expose some of them? One method is that you identify some weak BDS academics. And then you can check their books or have their books checked for plagiarism and for wrong footnotes. And thereafter you publish at their own university and in their own field internationally the shortcomings. And it will not be difficult to bring a few BDS professors down and destroy their careers. Most people in academia are cowards, and many other academics will decide that it is not worthwhile to risk their career by supporting BDS. Now you think, that sounds like a very theoretical idea, but I haven't invented it. 2 German ministers underwent such an investigation process. And afterwards their doctorate titles were cancelled. They resigned as ministers. The third one, Family Minister Franziska Giffey, was recently told by her university that her doctorate had shortcomings. They were not big enough to take her doctorate away. But some bloggers in Germany now derisively call her Dr. Shortcomings Giffey. In my rather diverse career, I have had insights in the world of big business, academia, media and politics. And one rule is true for all. A large percentage of these people in this area are cowards. And once you justifiably destroy the reputation of a few, the others become more careful. And once you destroy the career of a few BDS academics, the BDF movement in the universities will shrink to the hardcore anti-Israelis. And I would be surprised if these represent more than 10% of those who sign on to BDS. So far, I have pointed out to what I promised, the 3 major avenues to fight anti-Semitism. I've mentioned 2 of them. The first one is to make it better understood and widely accepted that anti-Semitism is an integral part of Western culture for more than 1,000 years. And the second is to set up an Israeli entity for anti-propaganda. So as my time is limited, I will now concentrate on the third and last major strategic priority avenue for action. You rarely hear this, but there is a millennia-old tradition of masochism in Judaism. It starts with the patriarch Abraham. He enters into a major discussion with God in an effort to prevent the destruction of Sodom. When God tells him, however, to sacrifice his own son, he doesn't try to argue, he remains silent. I cannot go, even though I have substantially written on the history of Jewish masochism, I cannot go into great detail here. We find examples in the Talmud, in our prayer book, and many places elsewhere. And in our own days, Woody Allen expresses it beautifully in Annie Hall, saying, "I am quite normal for a guy from Brooklyn." Contemporary Jewish masochists in Israel and abroad will tell you what is wrong with what Israel does. They will rarely, if ever, tell you what Israel's enemies or other countries do wrong. Israel has to be perfect, others not in their distorted views. And this, according to the CIJR definition of anti-Semitism, is an anti-Semitic attitude. These Jewish masochists are ideal, useful idiots to be manipulated by Israel's non-Jewish enemies. They can always base themselves on statements by masochist Jews to criticize Israel. In the United States, there is now a prominent Democratic presidential candidate who is a Jewish masochist, Bernie Sanders. He calls Netanyahu a racist and remains silent about Abbas, who has said that no Israelis will live in the Palestinian state. Many of us, many of you, know Jewish masochists. Tell them that by singling out Israel and remaining silent about the criminality of the Palestinians, they commit anti-Semitic acts. One of the many disgusting examples of Jewish masochism came after the German parliament voted to outlaw BDS. Then 240 Jewish academics, many from Israel, voted to the German government not to accept that parliamentary resolution. It would limit free speech. And if you outlaw BDS, it indeed limits free hate speech. The people in favor of unlimited free speech think that they are liberal Democrats. And these liberal Democrats and many other liberals are indirectly undermining the future of democracy. There is almost unlimited free speech on social media. Thus, social media has become the prime location for hate speech. Once you start looking, you find that in the liberal democratic environments in the countries, the police and the prosecution are understaffed. Many complaints are not dealt with. Judges let criminals off. It's a very difficult subject to research, but once you start looking at how it affects Jews, it becomes clearer. The interaction of Jews with society at large is often so major that you can draw very, very important conclusions. It's not that my arguments are finished, but my time is finished. I understand that there is a possibility of asking questions, and if you want to learn more about my views, I suggest you like my Facebook page, and if you cannot take it down from here, you simply Google it up. It was a great honor to be invited here and to speak before you, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gerstenfeld, for that excellent presentation. And Rafi will get the lights on momentarily. Are there any questions for the good doctor? I'm looking your way, Michael.
Thank you, Doctor. Far be it from me to defend Germany, but I believe that recently they've announced that they're completely going to outlaw Hezbollah, including the flying of their flags, for what it's worth. What I'd like to ask you is, do you
That's,
have
by the
any...
way, not true.
Sorry?
It's not true.
Well, then I guess my source was incorrect. But
No, there were people, sorry. Let me, before we go on, and then you can ask your
Okay.
question. There are people in Germany who want to outlaw them. These are two opposition parties, the small Liberal Party and the bigger populist right-wing AFD party. But the main parties, the government parties, don't want to do that.
okay, I'll have to go back to that, but I would like to hear what you have to say about the recent astonishing announcements from the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Look, the Archbishop of Canterbury, with whom I occasionally correspond, is the only non-Jew I know who has ever said that anti-Semitism is part of Western culture and is part of British culture.
And Christianity.
He's a very decent person. It so happens that his stepfather and I were 50 years ago colleagues in Paris. So I have a certain access to him.
But I'm just asking in terms of, isn't that a reassuring turn of events? And also that he basically agreed with the Chief Rabbi of England, saying that Jeremy Corbyn is not an appropriate or viable candidate for a British Prime Minister. I think that this was a good sign amidst all this evil.
There are good signs among this evil, even if the evil gets bigger. The Anglicans are not a very major denomination. There are probably more Muslims in church or in mosque every week than there are Anglicans. People are nominal Anglicans. I think it's fantastic what he did, and I like his other attitudes, but his weight in the International Christian World,
Can I use the microphone?
no, I can do that, his weight in the Christian world is not dramatically major, you have to realize. He has a weight, and I'm glad he does it, so at least I can quote one non-Jew when I speak about it, or write about one non-Jew who says that, but his weight is not so big as the head of the Catholic Church, for instance. And the reality is that the Catholic Church has also backed away after the Holocaust, which they have in part helped cause in a document which is called Nostra Aetate about 40 plus years ago, but it certainly didn't go as far as the Archbishop of Canterbury's.
There's a guy right behind Michael. Yeah, you?
Thank you.
I just wanted to check some words with you. I think there's maybe 2.5 billion Muslims in the world, and maybe
No,
no.
there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world.
And what percentage of that number, of maybe, I guess, 2/3 are adults. Would
No.
you say are anti-Semitic?
Classic anti-Semites for...
Could you repeat the question? I don't know if everyone heard.
Yeah, okay, the question was, which I have
The
corrected,
same
there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world.
Right.
What percentage of those are anti-Semites? We have only data in the world on classic anti-Semites. That doesn't include anti-Israelism. We have some data on anti-Israelism, for instance, in the UK, but that you cannot conclude from that. 49% are anti-Semites. But there is another consideration which is very important. You have the only heads of states which make anti-Israel propaganda or anti-Jewish propaganda all come from the Muslim world. You cannot find a single non-Muslim state, not even Venezuela, which makes anti-Semitic remarks. And there is an excellent proof of that, because there is something which is the Organization of Islamic Countries, which groups all the Islamic countries. And in 2002, they met in Malaysia, and there the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, who is a well-known anti-Semite, spoke about a worldwide battle against the Jews. And there were these 57 representatives of the 57 members of the OIC, and they all applauded him. So the only people who want genocide as a state is Iran. So Muslim anti-Semitism is the key of the main propagandas of hatred. Of course, you have in the United States, after these 2 synagogue murders, you think that extreme right is the big problem. It can be the big problem in individual countries, but from a worldwide view, the greatest threat against Israel comes from the Muslim world.
I see a hand over here. Yeah, was it you? Okay.
I'm wondering about the claim with the Catholic Church. We know the history of the Catholic Church, very anti-Semitic.
Sorry, I have some difficulty. Can you?
I'm having difficulty hearing you too. Sorry.
We know the history of the Catholic Church is very anti-Semitic, but in recent times, since Nostra Aetate, about 50 years ago, both the present Pope and official church doctrines say the new anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. So you have it both from the last 3 popes and from official documents stating that.
Look, I once discussed this issue with a former Israeli ambassador at the Vatican. He was there shortly after Nostra Aetate was published. And he said to me, the people in the Vatican said, that it will take 100 years from that to come down from the top to the bottom of the church. So it is true, the situation has improved thanks to the death of 6 million Jews, for which the church has a certain responsibility. But it is far from perfect. It is certainly far less than what the Archbishop of Canterbury says. But on the other hand, the Roman Catholic Church is much and much larger than the Anglicans, and the status of the Pope in the Catholic Church is much better than the status of the Archbishop of Canterbury among Anglicans outside the United Kingdom.
Ben, you had a question?
Yeah, on the issue of anti-propaganda campaigns. I personally have 5 podcasts that I run that deal with some of these issues. Now, we focus mainly on the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, postmodernism on university campuses, like that sort of thing. But we put this together with a shoestring budget over the past year and a half. And we're at the point where we have foreign governments that now contact us and send us information. Local police forces contact us and send us information. Why would the Israeli government not want to invest a small amount of capital? Do they not realize that the expansion of the MSA on university campuses here is targeting them as much as it's targeting us here? Why would they resist that?
The question is excellent, and I have never been able to answer it because I think the position is idiotic. But, and I cannot look into Netanyahu's brain, but there are 5 suppositions which I have made over the year. The first one is that he, and I have shown to you how complex it is. 500 years ago I would have finished in 5 minutes. Here I have only given you a very superficial lecture. He doesn't understand the problem. The second issue is that if he puts up an anti-propaganda agency, he has to take away competences of 3 government ministries, which together do very little. They do something, but it doesn't add up too much. The third reason is the Jewish masochism. The Jews have always been hated and attacked, so why would it be different when you have a Jewish state? The fourth reason, and I'm not so sure that that isn't the main one, he thinks that if he starts calling the Palestinians the criminals they are, and crime supporters, then the relations between the defense agency and the Palestinian security forces may suffer from that. And then there is a fifth reason, which is that a little bit of anti-Semitism is good for Aliyah. So what weighs more, as in the past, before I was Prime Minister, I had access to Netanyahu, it wasn't a problem. We talked occasionally. But nowadays I have no access, so I cannot tell you what is on his mind. I know from a friend of mine who leads one of the major American Jewish organizations that he has raised it with him 2 times. And he has been turned down each time.
Just one quick follow-up as well.
Sure.
I think you've articulated the Red-Green Alliance and how they're using postmodernism beautifully. But one of the things that we're seeing that's occurring here is the Generation Z, the Zoomers, they are primarily libertarian, more conservative leaning, and they hate Israel. And they hate Israel because they see organizations like ADL, for example, as a threat because they push back against, and this is just their opinion, they push back against freedom of speech. So the problem we have now growing amongst younger people, now we have the younger conservatives hate Israel, and the older, more mature people of Generation Y, they are left-end, Islamists, and they also hate Israel. So at what point, how are we going to address the younger generations that are coming through the pipeline?
Well, free speech will ultimately bring democracy down, because the social media are a major source of hatred, the major source of uncontrolled hatred. The ADL, under the present management, is not a major player in favor of the Jews. We have to say that very clearly. This is no longer Foxman, who was a strong voice. This is no longer there. Look, if you have an anti-propaganda agency, then you have people who monitor all developments in the major countries and develop like a business plan in business for each case. I cannot give you rapid answers on things which have to be studied, and have to be studied by a big government agency in Israel, rather than being left to hundreds of grassroots movements in the world. And if you want to start as an Israeli agency grassroots movements, you have a very, very major powerful force. But Netanyahu doesn't want to see it. That's the crux of the matter.
Now, I know there's still questions on this side of the room, but were there any on this side? Anyone? I could have sworn I saw a few hands up earlier. Yes, you.
The recent vote in the United Nations where Canada voted against Israel, or voted in support of an anti-Israel topic. Have we had any kind of a response from the Prime Minister's office or from the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations in response to the protests that we've all sent towards the Prime Minister on the petition?
Well, this Canadian question, I don't. Canada is not part of the main countries I study.
You're looking at me. Let me get back to you.
It's about the occupation.
No, let me just say one remark. If you Google it up, you find an article of mine in which I say that the ambassador who votes an anti-Semitic resolution according to the CIJR definition cannot, like the German soldiers, say order is order, Befehl ist Befehl. He has a personal responsibility according to the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. So he himself becomes a part-time anti-Semite if he follows the orders of his government.
Okay. Actually, Rafi, how much more time do we have?
I go to bed at midnight.
Okay, all right. Murray and then Andrea.
I retired about 20 years ago, and my hobby is anti-Semitism. I read the book by Nuremberg that you mentioned. I'm 3/4 of the way through a book called Why the Jews? Do you know that book, sir?
No.
That's the question I'm asking you.
Why the Jews?
Why the Jews?
I'll tell you immediately. That is one of the easiest questions to answer. If you go through, if you go to a website which I publish, it's called Bad News from the Netherlands. And this website, I put 5 times a week, if I have the time, a bad true item about the Netherlands, because I've created a website to see how you demonize a country. So by now, you can read 3,500 negative items on the Netherlands. That doesn't mean that there are no good things in the Netherlands, but that's not my aim to mention those. You don't have to read those 3,500. There is every week, and it is not important which week you take. You only have to read the front page, which are 7 negative items. My experience is that when I take my iPad and show it to people, that a substantial number of people, and they of course know nothing about Holland, after they have read the 7 items say, this is a country I would never visit. 7 items. Now here you have 1,500 years. The church, which saw in the Jews its competitors, and I'm not a Freudian, but the Oedipus complex of the people who were there before, exceeded by far what I have done with this little demonstration case. So the church has hammered it into Western society, and that is by the Jews.
Andrea, you had a question?
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the fact that you brought forward a lot of statistics. So one of the Muslim women that works very well with the Zionist community here has a program, many of you will know, a video on Clarion Project, where she says 64% of Muslims support Sharia law. So it's higher than 49% who are anti-Semite, because she points out that support for Sharia law is in itself probably quite anti-Semitic, but it's also very anti-Western liberal democracy. So if the threat is not just to the Jews, but to all of the Western culture as we know it, why are people not responding? Forget the Jews, who are, as you said, a small population. Why is Western democracy ignoring the impact of the Islamic movement?
Essentially, because they're stupid. I was writing, my idea until 2015 was that Germany, of course, you cannot get all this Nazism rapidly out of a society, but they were on a good way, it was fading away. When Merkel brought in 1 million Muslims, she created a right-wing party, and even though I have some contact with some people in that party, you also have there, in particular in East Germany, a right-wing wing of the AfD. And the East Germans say, Merkel always said they couldn't pay us Western German salaries because the German government didn't have the billions of money, of euros, to pay us. Now suddenly there are those billions of money which they are paying to Muslims who have no relation with here. So you get the AfD, which is a party, certainly part of it, not without problems, is the second largest party in Eastern Germany, created by the German Democrats. They are basically stupid. Now, who am I to say that they're basically stupid? Because, I'll give you another example. In France, the big anti-Israel movement started in the year 2000 after the Intifada. And the country where it started was France. So what did certain Muslims do? They started to attack individual Jews and Jewish synagogues. The government said, the government denied that there was such a thing. Why did they deny it? Because it was bad for the social structure of French society.
That's what I'm saying. I think that there's so many cases, and the Europeans can't, and the North Americans be blind to the fact that these incidents are happening and are Islamist driven, and yet we don't talk about it. I mean, I read a study that suggested that when Notre Dame was on fire, they were saying it's an accident. There's plenty of evidence that that was no accident, and that in the year prior, 1,000 churches had been burned or attacked in France. So, you know, this was the Notre Dame event actually was the third time somebody tried to blow it up. They know there was an Islamist attack. Why are people afraid
I'm
to
not
say
sure
that?
that Notre Dame, I looked at the program last week.
Information about that. I'd just like to know why that's not even being considered. The first thing out of everybody's mouth is, we don't know if it was terrorist, or there was a mental illness, or we'll investigate it, or...
Look, this touches at the heart of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, in my opinion, and I've said that, so I am not even if somebody takes it down and publish it, that the First Amendment of the American Constitution is obsolete. It has to be changed. I am also saying that if liberal democracy not evolves, it will destroy democracy. They simply don't want to see it.
Do you not worry that if there's suppression, if free speech isn't as wild as it is, the people that will be suppressed will be people like us?
The Jews.
Yeah.
This is a frequent argument. You don't have to suppress free speech, you have to suppress free hate speech. And Canada is not bad at that, as far as I remember. Never given much attention to the Canadian situation. But my conversations with Canadian scholars were that there are anti-hate speech laws in Canada. In the United States, it's a disaster. So in Europe, in some countries there are, but the hate speech, for instance, in the Netherlands, where there were a number of cases, are against Jews. You can tomorrow say the most terrible things about Israel. Ultimately, I mean, there are enough scholars who think that Europe is in decline, in decay, the European Union is in decay, but it takes time. I'll give you an example, which I have already half mentioned. In 2000, start the attacks, massive attacks on the Jews. The government refuses to call it anti-Semitism. How do you do that? Very simple. Because, first of all, in order to complain about anti-Semitism, you have to go to the police. You go to the police and you tell that you were a victim of an anti-Semitic incident. The police then immediately puts it down under the more general heading of hooliganism. Then you send all these data to the Minister of the Interior, who wasn't an anti-Semite. He had really good relations with the Jews, but it wasn't good for the socialist government, so he massaged the things. I'll give you a second example. In Germany, probably most incidents, anti-Semitic incidents, are caused by right-wingers, but there are also many by Muslims. But only in 49% of the cases, you cannot find out who is the perpetrator, because he doesn't identify before he calls you a lousy Jew. So what does the German government do? It gives the statistics on the 51 cases and then calls the other 49 right-wing. So then a great majority of incidents in Germany is right-wing, which is not necessarily true. And every year the Minister of the Interior, who knows that he is lying, gives these official statistics. And you can say, well, that is crazy, but that's how the world is.
Yes, Dora.
I'm just wondering if you have any advice, as individuals, what can we do to combat anti-Semitism?
No, well, I think as an individual you can first of all attack the Jewish masochists. The Jewish masochists are a huge problem. All these pro-Palestinian Jews who are in fact allies of murderers. That is what the individual in the who is not. You can join an organization, but the individual, if you have acquaintances who keep telling each time to you, or rabbis, which is more an issue in the United States, where you have all these J Street and even more left rabbis who are blaming Israel, then here it is more an issue of individuals, I guess.
We do have, we've got other organizations that, here in Canada, that take up that sort of, that Jewish masochist space.
Self-hating Jews, yeah.
Yeah.
But you can tell them, okay, when have you last spoken about the murder of Israeli citizens and the Palestinian authority who pays that? Are you not paying that? You are apparently friendly with the murderers. I mean, you have to massage it, but it's very unpleasant for people to be, for Jews to be exposed that way. But again, the Israeli government is at fault. If they had coordinated all these activities, many of the Jewish masochists would disappear. I mean, I say that we have them at Hebrew University, we have them at all universities. It's very simple.
I see a question from our host, Rafi.
Yeah, no, let me finish this. If if I go to the grocer around the corner and his assistant tells me that I better go to the supermarket, the assistant is fired. But if you have a professor at Hebrew University who says Israel should be boycotted, he is not fired. So the question is, who is smarter, the heads of the university or the grocer? Yeah.
Once you've been in Canada a while, you'll know that Canada, including our Prime Minister, are phenomenal in apologizing. Apologizing for everything, anything we do something, we apologize. Israel has, in the last 70 some odd years, also only apologized, has never gone on the offensive. And being an Israeli myself and living in Germany, in Austria, and in Switzerland, I've seen less blatant anti-Semitism than I have seen in Canada, living here for 40 years. But we're still always apologizing. We have never, ever gone on the offensive, always defensive, even militarily, always in the defensive manner. How do we change the whole thought pattern of the Jew to go on the offensive instead of being always on the defense?
Look, you now mentioning Jewish culture. Jewish culture has learned over the generations that Jews are always suffering. And it takes a long time to change culture. Obviously, if you have an anti-propaganda agency, that is a change of culture. The best defense is offense.
Yeah.
But we don't do that because it is not in our DNA, which of all these generations of the Galut. And that, of course, the Israeli government, with a few exceptions, has that attitude. First of all, they are ignorant. These are people who have come from, are Israeli educated, have never lived abroad, have no real idea what goes on in the world. Some of them, of course, Netanyahu is very well educated. I usually spoke English with him rather than Hebrew, even though most of us can speak Hebrew very well. But he is almost the exception. Sharansky once told me that when he raised diaspora problems, he was in the Sharon government. Only Sharon supported him, the others had zero interest. That is a reality which is very difficult to change if the Prime Minister doesn't put his foot down. This is a Prime Minister who doesn't want to put his foot down. However, I am not saying that I do not respect what he has achieved, because he's finally the only politician in the world who can talk as an equal to Trump and Putin. There is nobody else. So that's already, and then you have his relations with the giant Indian establishment, and okay, more problematic with Brazil, but these are major countries. So he has achievements, but on certain other things he's a failure.
Okay, well, last question.
So maybe Israel, one way to explain it is that they have enough problems being surrounded by so many enemies and so many military issues, that the mindset is that diaspora is not a priority. So let's say that's the reality, even though I don't agree with it, and I agree with you that that should be one of the top priorities. But what about the leadership in diaspora? I mean, to lean on Israel that is already has their issues. What about, I put the finger at the federations, they have a lot of money, they collect a lot of donations. What about creating task forces or units to deal with it here on the ground, because it's just getting worse. And this mindset of Dina de Malchuta Dina, that after Bar Kochva, that we just sit passively and wait for Hashem to solve everything, or Israel. We can't wait. God helps those who help themselves. And it seems to me like things are getting worse and worse and worse on campuses, in synagogues, and we just sit, we can't wait for Israel to do something. I feel like we need to take action here, and I put the finger on the leadership here, whether it's universities, whether it's UJA, whether it's other organizations, they're not being active enough and proactive.
First of all, I don't agree with you on the basic assumption. If I speak about an anti-propaganda agency, I do not say that because of the moral obligation Israel has to the Galut. I say it is because it is first of all in Israel's own interest. Israel is thus neglecting, first of all, its own interest by not putting up that agency. We have to realize that, and I know very little about Canada. What I know about Canada is from my professor friends who over the years have told me a bit. Canadian Jewry has traditionally had a weak leadership. I remember something which I called the Montebello Agreement, which was when the leadership here agreed with the government not to make too much noise, and which was rejected by the community. And I always had the feeling that Canada was simply following the British Jews, but in the last 4 years, I really want to publish soon a piece on it, British Jewry has radically changed. It's not going to make aliyah, but in the fight against the labor, it has radically changed its attitude, which I understand was also the Canadian attitude, you just handle your affairs in direct talks with the authorities, and you don't make public noise. British Jewry today has abandoned, thanks to Labour anti-Semitism, this issue. The leadership of Jews in the world, and as I was in my many decades ago, I was chairman of the World Union of Jewish Students. The Jewish leadership today is weakening. If you look at the United States, I have a book on the United States from 2002 where I interviewed 16 of the American Jewish leaders. And every expert on America will tell you that the leadership has moved away from the top of the major organizations to the grassroots organizations. And that is a problem. I mean, the leaders who were there at the time, to me, seemed much better than what is around today. And in the US, you have President's Conference, which was a smart move. And the man who really managed that, Hönlein, who I knew from my student days, he has remarkably get them together. But I'm not sure that now he retires, that will still be happening. The ADL has gone down in a major way. The American Jewish Congress hangs on one man, Harris. The Wiesenthal Center is quite, and they are close friends of mine, is quite active, but Rabbi Heyer is 75 or something like that. So you see that the old leadership is fading away. In my youth there was Nachum Goldman, who was called the king of the Jews. These people are fading away, and you get more mediocre and more local leadership. That's the reality. And when you talk to American Jewish sociologists 10 years ago, you said there are two pillars in the Jewish world, Israel and the United States. And then there is a little pillar which wants to become a pillar, Europe. Today Europe is not a pillar of any kind. Besides that, you have creaming. Of course, the French Jews have not massively emigrated, but there are 150,000 Jews out of 500,000 who carry the community. And almost all the people who have emigrated, some 40,000, come out of the core. So, and that you see everywhere. When I was at school, I went to the only Jewish high school in the Netherlands. And of my class, we were 14 when we finished school. Only 4 remained in the Netherlands, and you had that. So these people who are the future leaders are coming to Israel or emigrating elsewhere. So you see this shrinking of leadership almost everywhere. And Israel versus the Galut, there is no comparison. There are perhaps still more Jews in the Galut than there are in Israel. But the power of Israel as a force towards the power of the Galut has incomparably changed toward Israel. That's why I say only the anti-propaganda agency from Israel can radically change the situation. You can go to your local leaders and push them, that is always healthy. But the possibility to expect that they will radically change unless major disasters happen is unlikely. Even the US hasn't changed after September 11. It so happens that I was in September 11 in Washington. So I saw it closely. I couldn't see up to the Pentagon, which was burning, but I saw it closely. It hasn't sunk in. And many more Europeans will have to die before it will start to sink in. And that will take time. And we don't have time, and that's why I say only Israel can change the situation. And once Israel really takes this in its hand, then the grassroots in the communities abroad will start pushing their leaders. That's the explanation I can give you.
Okay, well, thank you. I would like to thank the Lodzer Synagogue for hosting us. I would like to thank Lauren Isaacs of Root Canada for promoting this event, Andrea Spindell of the Canadian Antisemitism Education Foundation, and Kulanu Canada also helped us spread out the word. And thank all of you for being here. And Dr. Gerstenfeld isn't going to run away just yet, so if you have a couple of other questions, you can get him before he walks up those stairs. Thank you all for coming.
Is this video, you can see it in the internet?
Yeah, we have a YouTube channel, on a YouTube channel, Lodzer Congregation, and it'll be posted. Shalom.